Welcome to everyone, and those of you who made it in the marathon long-haul run from the RISE meeting this morning. This is completely different, but of course some of the comments I made there were drawing from Young Lives data, so you'll really get a chance to see where that information came from here. And the school effectiveness surveys are something we've been conducting primarily for children in secondary schools now, but they're children who have been followed initially from their first year of life in the Young Lives survey. So that's what makes this data very unique. Young Lives has been following 4 groups of pupils in 4 countries, as many of you know, for more than 15 years. I'll give you a bit of background to that data in a moment, but before that, just to summarize what the focus of each of the school surveys in each of the countries has been, because they're very different contexts. Vietnam, India, 2 states, which is Telangana and Andhra Pradesh, Ethiopia and Peru, have very different education systems, and there are lots of difficulties in comparing directly across countries, but there are many things that are valuable in doing so, and we're attempting to draw those out by focusing on topics that are peculiar to that country, but which also have some broader resonance for education policy elsewhere. So, for example, in India, unsurprisingly, we focus on private schools, the relative effectiveness of private schools compared to public schools. And in the state of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, now more than 50% of children actually attend private schools at the primary level. And that's growing at the secondary level too. So it's not a minority phenomenon. The vast majority ultimately would attend private schools if those trends continued in India. So looking at that is quite essential. In Ethiopia, we're looking at school effectiveness, and this is the first secondary school survey of any size on school effectiveness in Ethiopia. So we're able to look at how schools are performing between different types of schools and individual schools, but also within schools. And Jack will talk about school effectiveness in Ethiopia, including differential school effectiveness. So are schools equally effective for all kinds of pupils, or are there some schools which are better than others depending on the kinds of intakes that they have? And then thirdly, Vietnam, which of course is kind of well known now, especially since the PISA data, as being one of the most high-performing developing countries in education. In fact, the most highly performing developing country in education, but which is now poised for a new stage of development, in a sense, towards 21st century skills. And the Vietnamese Ministry of Education is very keen to develop what they sometimes call soft skills, what we more broadly call 21st century skills, those skills which are to differentiate from, as it were, industrializing countries to the 4th industrial revolution, towards communication, towards teamwork, and those other kinds of valuable skills in the economy. And we look at how Vietnam may be achieving that through the first, as far as I'm aware, the first tests of those skills in Vietnam. And then finally, Santiago will talk specifically about the Peru school survey, which has a slightly different timescale from the other 3, and which is focused on inequalities in educational opportunities and outcomes. And many of you may know that Peru is one of the most unequal countries in the world, so that is the appropriate topic to focus on there. And finally, a little bit in terms of the methodology, we will talk a bit about the difficulties in comparing across countries and in the balance between methodological rigor and contextual relevance when making comparisons between school systems. So for those of you who haven't come across the Young Lives school surveys and the Young Lives household surveys, a brief introduction to how they work. They are longitudinal. The Young Lives study itself is a longitudinal survey of children born in 2 years, either 2000 and 2001 or 1994 and 1995, and they are children who've been followed for the period 15 years since then. The sample survey is in 20 sentinel sites in each of the 4 countries. So it's not a nationally representative survey, but the sites are selected purposively to reflect the diversity within the country. So that includes diversity in demographics, economic conditions, food security. So the purpose is to get a balance of sites which represent the country without necessarily doing so statistically. That gives a total in each country of 3,000 children selected at the household, 2,000 of those younger children, 1,000 older children, total of 12,000 across all of the countries. And we focus on the school surveys only on the younger cohort children. So those are the children on whom we have got information right back to their birth. So the 20 sites, as I said, are selected to be representative of the country, but in a pro-poor way. So we exclude the most advantaged areas of the country in selecting that sample because, of course, it's focused on the development issues. So what we're taking out are elite schools and elite pupils. That diagram there represents the growth of the children over time, the cohorts and the surveys. So the household surveys have been conducted every 3 or 4 years since round 1 in 2002. Up to the last round of data collection, round 5 in 2016. That collects information on both the older and the younger cohorts at their households. And that is a broad range of information, including all sorts of information you'd expect to find in a DHS or other type of household survey, plus rich information on education and time use and other qualitative data. So the school surveys, which we're focusing on here, come out of those household surveys because the household surveys form the sampling frame for the school surveys. So the intention is to collect information on the quality of schools attended by the Young Lives children, the younger cohort children. So we go typically to the schools that are located in the sites where the younger cohort children live. And there's slight differences between the countries in exactly how we do that because it's not always possible to go to every school in a country like India where there are a huge number of schools. We then sample schools, whereas in Ethiopia and Vietnam it's more likely that we have been to every school in the site. So the specific feature of the rest of the design, which we'll focus on a lot in the rest of the presentations, is about school effectiveness and value-added measures. So one of the things that we have in Young Lives is longitudinal data on children's backgrounds, but we also, in the school survey, are collecting longitudinal data at the school level. So we go at the beginning of the school year to collect information on the school, but also to collect test score data on children in 2 or more subjects. And then at the end of the school year, we revisit the same schools, testing the same children in the same subjects in order to be able to have a longitudinal measure of progress. And that makes this survey different in respect to the fact that there are fewer problems in dealing with causation, fewer problems in dealing with explanations of performance if you've got more than one measure. Because, for example, we're, as a result, able to separate to a certain extent, the effects of background characteristics from the effects of schools. And if you don't have 2 measures, those 2 things will be confounded. So, just briefly on the age of the children, it's intended that we go to schools which serve children who are in the younger cohort. So they should be the same age. But in fact, as it happens, children attend school in slightly different patterns. They start later in Ethiopia, and also the cycles of schooling are different. So children in Ethiopia stay in primary school for 5 years, whereas in Vietnam it's just 5 years. So what we have to make this sensible is children in grades 7 and 8 in Ethiopia, grade 9 in India, and grade 10 in Vietnam. So as I already mentioned, the design focuses on school effectiveness and on value added. So we're really interested not just in cross-sectional performance, which is what you have in PISA, but in the change in performance over time, that which can be attributed to the school and which can then be considered as the value of the schooling. And then to look at how those value-added estimates relate to characteristics of the school. So what kinds of teachers, what kinds of schools, what kinds of learning processes are associated with more progress or more effective schooling. And those obviously are very important questions for any education system, which are quite difficult to get at. So we have cognitive tests at the beginning and end of the year, background instruments for all the children, psychological measures or psychosocial measures which contextualize the learning progress at the individual level, and then also instruments at the teacher and school level. So what's the purpose of value-added analysis? In addition to what I've said, it will give us all of the information we need on objective performance at a particular point in time, but also allow us to get a better picture of the differences in school quality and how they link to what's going on in the school and to the backgrounds of the children who are in the schools. So the 4 research questions that we're attempting to address all together in this set of analyses, and we've got obviously data sets for individual countries, and we've got the ability to link those data sets so that we can then conduct analyses which are comparative. So firstly, what are students' learning levels in core curricula and transferable skill domains? And this is particularly important in countries where that kind of evidence is not available. Some countries do have routine data collection exercises, others don't. in Ethiopia particularly, there is very little data on what actual curricular skills are and how they relate to expectations. So how do they compare across contexts, between contexts, but also in relation to national expectations given by curricula? And then secondly, how do students progress over time, and what are the predictors of learning attainment and progress? And of course, progress can either be equitable or inequitable. It can either be more or less equalizing. And those things matter a lot, because if gaps are very wide at the beginning in the younger years of schooling and they get wider still, then the gaps are pretty much unbridgeable. But there are some indications in some education systems that there is a lot that can be done to reduce gaps as time goes on. And for that, again, you need longitudinal data. Thirdly, what are the axes of inequality and inequity which shape educational trajectories, and how might they be mitigated? And that's a key point, again, for a development-focused survey. How can it reduce inequity, or how can policy reduce inequality? And what can we see about schools that are doing that? Because the most informative indications for policy are real ones from schools that have already conducted such kinds of policies, or which have achieved, let's say, narrowing of gaps under certain circumstances. And that variation gives us some indications of what might be successful policies. Fourthly, what are the characteristics of effective schools in particular contexts, and how does school effectiveness vary according to key school policy choices? For example, the difference between public and private schools, or the effectiveness of different choices of languages of instruction, for example, which is an issue particularly in Ethiopia. So are there things that some schools are already doing that other schools could be doing? And that's the last kind of phase of the value-added research, to be able to take out those value-added estimates and link them to characteristics that we have about the schools. So Santiago, do you want to say something about Peru? Or, yeah, why not?
I need a microphone then.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. The school survey is a little bit different from the other ones in a sense. We had done the 4 school surveys in primary schools a few years ago, so we didn't want to get out of the picture and do this one also in secondary school. So the aim is to analyze inequality of opportunities and outcomes at the end of secondary education in Peru, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about it later. The sample, the core was the Young Lives children, so we managed to enroll about a little bit over 500 students and all their peers in 181 schools, 69 private and 112 public schools. And we had them from 3 grades, the last 3 grades in secondary schools. So we can see progress also across grades, but we only have one measurement, cross-sectional design, which was, I mean, what we could do with the resources, and also it goes to the core of what we wanted to do in Young Lives. We wanted to see, or we want to see eventually with this, if the same inequalities that we observe in household conditions, in lots of variables, are resembled, show up also in inequalities in schools. And again, I'll come back to this later. And we just finished data gathering a month ago, so I'll talk about it later. Thank you.